Have you ever felt as if life suddenly pulled the ground out from under you, without warning? As if someone you loved deeply decided you were disposable, like an abandoned suitcase circling endlessly on some airport conveyor belt? That's exactly how it all began for me. A farewell with no words, only the sharp silence of rejection. And no, this isn't a metaphor. I was literally abandoned in the lounge of an airport by my own son. The first reaction? You can probably guess: confusion, pain, disbelief. But what came after was something even I didn't expect. Because at the very bottom of the pit, that dark, cold, lonely place where you think you'll rot away in sorrow, sometimes courage is born. This is the story of an abandonment that turned into rebirth. Of a family betrayal that pushed me straight into the arms of freedom. And before you think this is some tale of revenge, let me stop you right here. It's not. This is about autonomy. About how dignity can be reclaimed even after it's been tossed aside like it's worth nothing. If you've ever felt invisible in your own home, ignored by the very people who should protect you, or crushed under expectations that were never yours to begin with, then this story is for you. Over the next few minutes, it'll take you on a real journey. No frills. No magical endings. But with one promise: when you learn to respect yourself, even abandonment can turn into freedom. And if any part of this journey speaks to you, makes you reflect on your own path, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We'll keep talking about fresh starts, courage, and the power of choosing yourself. Fasten your seatbelt. Because my life began again right there, between suitcases, flight announcements, and a one-way ticket. And maybe, just maybe, you'll realize it's time to book yours too. It was in the International Terminal Lounge that everything truly fell apart. Martha sat there, her purse clutched in her lap, eyes scanning the hall for familiar faces. They had said they were just going to the restroom, maybe grab a coffee. Something ordinary, every day. She believed them. She still believed. Because when you love someone, it takes a while to understand when you're being left behind. Time passed slowly. People around her boarded, hugged, laughed, cried. And she stayed there, her heart sinking deeper into a strange, frozen silence. The first hour was patient waiting. She even joked with herself they probably got lost in the duty-free shop. She smiled, trying to smother that uneasy knot in her stomach. But as the minutes turned into hours, the smile faded. She began checking her phone more often. No replies. She sent messages, tried calling. The signal flickered, but nothing came through. Martha could feel something draining inside her, as if her trust was being siphoned out drop by drop. Unease became discomfort. Discomfort turned into anguish. The kind of anguish that sits heavy in your throat, the one you cover up just to keep from breaking down in public. When she finally realized she had been waiting far too long, she got up and walked to the airline desk. With a trembling voice, she asked about her family's flight. The clerk typed, checked, and answered with the kind of casual tone people use when they don't realize they're crushing a soul. That flight departed about 40 minutes ago. The names you mentioned are all listed as boarded. That's when the ground disappeared. There was no scene, no shouting. Only an eerie silence and the muffled sound of her own heart crashing down. Martha thanked him mechanically, as if she had just received a sentence, and went back to her seat. Now she knew. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Not a mistake. Not a delay. It was rejection. Cold, deliberate, executed with precision. The woman who had spent her whole life pleasing, sacrificing, giving, had just been left behind like a burden. And all of it without warning, without confrontation, without even the courtesy of an explanation. Abandonment, much like loneliness, has a metallic taste, part blood, part shame. And there, surrounded by strangers, she began to understand that this wasn't just an ending. It was a message. Cruel, yes, but clear. She was no longer wanted. The pain was almost physical, as if someone had ripped a piece out of her chest and left a hollow cavity where hope used to be. Martha thought of her grandchildren, of family gatherings, of all the times she had erased herself to make everyone else comfortable. She asked herself, when did I become a burden? What unforgivable thing did I do? But those questions had no answers. People who abandon rarely explain. They just vanish, leaving the victim trapped between guilt and the desperate, pointless effort to understand. That limbo is where the deepest suffering lives. Hours passed. Automatic doors opened and closed, the world moving forward while she sat frozen in time. No sign of her family. No message. Nothing. The sting of betrayal burned worse than any words could describe. And yet, in the rubble, something faint began to spark. Fragile, almost invisible, but real. Maybe it was the beginning of courage, the kind you don't choose, the kind that shows up only when abandonment becomes the air you breathe. There in that airport, surrounded by planes departing and arriving, Martha realized she was truly alone. But she also realized that, for the first time, she had the power to decide what to do with that solitude. She cried, of course. With shame, with anger, with fear. But she cried quietly, as if cleansing her soul to prepare for rebirth. In the absence of other arms, she held herself. In the absence of respect, she chose to respect herself. And in that absolute silence, something inside her whispered, maybe you don't have to beg to be loved anymore. Midnight came, and with it, the first real decision she had made in years. Martha looked up at the departures board, scanned the destinations, and for the first time thought, what if I just left? That question, which once would have seemed absurd, suddenly made perfect sense. Because if someone could abandon her without notice, maybe she could also walk away. Without asking permission. Without giving notice. Just go. For her autonomy. For her dignity. For the chance to finally live for herself. That was how abandonment began, slowly, painfully to transform into a seed of freedom. Her phone remained silent. No calls, no voicemails, nothing. She clung to the idea that maybe it was all a mistake, that they had boarded thinking she was already on the plane. The mind invents excuses when the heart isn't ready to face the truth. But deep down she knew. The pain of rejection leaves no room for illusions. Still, in one last fragile attempt to believe the impossible, she went back to the airline counter, looking for a scrap of hope. This time, a different clerk, Kinder, pulled up the reservation record. He hesitated, then explained that 3 tickets had been successfully used. 3. Martha was the 4th name on the list. Her ticket had been cancelled just hours before the flight, manually, with administrative access, intentionally. No mistake. No accident. It was planned. Official. The abandonment had been orchestrated. The woman who had held everything together for years was now deemed disposable. The blow wasn't just emotional, it felt almost legal. The pain gave way to indignation, and with it came her first rush of clarity. She felt invaded, deceived, betrayed. But also free. Because when the naked truth finally stares you down, you stop fighting for scraps of affection. Dignity, at last, begins to return. She left with the printed reservation records in her hands. Proof. Not to use in court, but to anchor herself in reality. Still, she couldn't stop replaying the sacrifices she had made for the very people who had rejected her. How many trips had she skipped to babysit grandchildren? How many parties missed because she was always available? How many times had she heard, "You're amazing, Mom," and believed it? Now everything fell into place. They had been preparing this for a while, waiting for the right moment to discard her without confrontation. Her mind wandered through 1,000 memories. The last conversation with her son came back to her, when he told her it was maybe time to start thinking more about herself. Back then, it sounded like concern. Now, she saw the subtext. It was rehearsal. A goodbye disguised as advice. And she, ever naive, had believed him. The truth hit hard. The abandonment had started long before the airport. It had come in subtle comments, sidelong glances, invitations that stopped arriving. And now, it was undeniable. Cruel, yes, but also liberating. Loneliness started to feel less terrifying. Because she finally realized the presence of those who hurt you isn't company, it's prison. She had been trapped in a role that no longer made sense. The caregiver. the available one, the invisible one. And when someone refuses to leave that role, life eventually shoves you out. Sometimes gently, sometimes brutally, but always necessarily. Courage doesn't grow in comfort. It is born in despair, in abandonment, in that emotional injustice that screams enough. And Martha, trembling but listening, began to hear that inner scream. With the papers in her purse and her soul shattered, she sat again, but with a different gaze. The anger was still there, yes. But so was something new, a spark of empowerment. For the first time, she knew exactly where she stood. No illusions. No fantasies. Just the raw, painful truth: she had been betrayed. But she had also been released. And that changed everything. Because when someone throws you away, they unwittingly hand you the keys to your own autonomy. Martha, though she didn't yet fully realize it, was already walking toward independence. It's strange how, after a blow like that, the world looks sharper. Masks fall. Roles dissolve. What's left is just you, with your pain and your choices. In that cold lounge, surrounded by strange voices and flight announcements that weren't hers, Martha saw life crack open a tiny doorway. Small but real. Freedom sometimes comes dressed as tragedy. And she began to understand that, although she hadn't chosen this abandonment, she could choose what to do with it. Her old life had departed. Now it was time to head in a different direction. The next morning, after a sleepless night without even tears, because even crying gets exhausting, Martha woke up changed. It was as if the sadness had settled to the bottom of the glass, leaving something stronger behind: resolve. She knew she couldn't stay at that airport, waiting for someone to come back for her. No one would. That realization hit like a punch to the stomach, but it also pushed her forward. For the first time in years, she didn't need to ask what others wanted. It was just her and her choices. For the first time, solitude tasted like possibility. Her mind still cloudy, she opened her phone and searched destinations. She wasn't looking for tourist attractions or trendy spots. She wanted anonymity. A place to relearn how to breathe, where her past wouldn't follow her. That's how she found Portland. A name with a gentle sound, far enough away, yet still within her own country. Nothing symbolic, nothing planned. Just a direction. And for someone who had spent her life orbiting around others, that was already a revolution. To choose where to go. Alone. For herself. That was freedom, wearing ordinary clothes. Martha took a deep breath and opened the bank account no one knew about. A modest amount, built from small, hidden deposits over the years, side jobs, unreported payments. A secret account. Not out of malice, but survival instinct. Deep down, she had always known she would need it. And now, that quiet stash became her ticket to autonomy. With trembling hands, she bought the ticket. One way. And when she clicked confirm, her heart pounded differently. It was fear, yes. But it was also courage. It was almost ironic. She had always managed the family's finances, paying bills, balancing spreadsheets, controlling expenses. But no one ever asked her what she wanted to do with the money. Now, with just a few clicks and no one's permission, she used her own resource to take the first step into her new life. Buying that ticket was a simple act on paper, but monumental for her soul. It was her first no to submission. Her first yes to herself. It wasn't running away. It was reclaiming. Dignity was being rebuilt digit by digit. She printed the ticket and tucked it away like a passport to another life. Sitting there, sipping terrible airport coffee, she watched other passengers rushing to their gates. None of them knew what was going on inside that tired-looking woman with weary eyes now burning with determination. She wasn't waiting to be saved anymore. The Martha who accepted crumbs had boarded the earlier flight and disappeared. This Martha, though unsure of what lay ahead, had chosen to move forward. And that choice alone was a thunderous, silent cry of liberation. Standing in the boarding line, the reality finally sank in. She was leaving. Leaving it all. The city. The routine. The image of the devoted mother. And, most of all, the suffocating feeling of invisibility. With a backpack on her shoulders and a shattered soul, she mentally said goodbye to everything that had chained her. And surprisingly, she felt relief. Relief tangled with guilt because for so long, she had believed that freedom was selfish. But now she understood selfishness is expecting someone to live in chains out of fear of being left behind. Freedom is respect even for yourself. During the flight, she cried softly. Not from sadness, but from release. Each tear was a page turned, a painful memory processed. She stared out the window as if searching for her future among the clouds. She didn't know what awaited her in Portland. She had no place to stay, no one to call. But she carried something she had never truly held before: control of her own story. She was no longer a satellite orbiting her family. She was a star, trying to ignite again. And even though her light had been dimmed for years, there was still warmth there waiting to be rekindled. When the plane touched down in Portland, something inside her settled. The city wasn't magical, wasn't bright or beautiful. But it was new. And newness smells sweet when you've been trapped in the past too long. As she stepped out of the plane and felt the cold wind on her face, Martha knew she was no longer the abandoned woman. She was the woman who chose to move on. That ticket hadn't just taken her to another state, it had taken her to another state of being. And with that, her story began to shift. Still scared, yes. But with a seed of resilience ready to grow. That first night in Portland had no fireworks, no victory. Just silence. And in that silence, a loneliness that weighed heavy. Martha stepped off the bus slowly, following her GPS to the nearest cheap motel. It was shabby, almost ugly, with stained carpet and a reception desk that smelled of stale smoke. But in that small, stuffy room, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. For the first time, no one expected anything of her. No one demanded. No one judged. It was just her, four walls, and the muted noise of the street outside. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she slipped off her shoes and stared at her hands. They looked strange, almost unfamiliar. Hands that had cooked, cleaned, carried groceries, held children. Now, they rested empty. But free. Martha didn't quite know what to do with that freedom. It felt awkward, like wearing a new outfit not yet broken in. But there, in that disconnected silence, she began to listen to herself. No outside voices. No interruptions. Only the sound of her own heart beating with newfound autonomy. She spent the next day wandering the neighborhood, observing people, cafes, modest shop windows. She wasn't looking for luxury. She was looking for normal. A place to just exist, unnoticed. Each corner offered the possibility of starting over. Every step, however small, was an act of courage. She had no plan yet. Only one direction: never go back. Because going back would mean betraying herself. It would mean accepting the role of the invisible woman again. And no matter how much she missed the noise of family life, Martha knew this silence was necessary. Learning to hear yourself again requires space. Requires pause. Above all, it requires respect. Respect for yourself. She had spent years living by others' rules, following scripts she hadn't written. Now, for the first time, she could even choose what to eat for dinner without worrying about anyone else's preferences. It sounds small, but it's monumental. Those who have lived in chains know freedom lives in the details. In strong coffee without sugar. In wearing pajamas all day. In rereading a book without interruptions. Slowly, she began rediscovering these tiny pleasures, like finding relics buried under years of obligation. At night, the longing crept in. But it wasn't for her family, it was for the illusion of belonging. For the affection she once believed was real. Now alone, she asked herself, how many times did I mistake attention for love? How many times did I accept so little because I thought I didn't deserve more? Painful questions, yes. But liberating ones. Because when you begin to question, you begin to heal. And healing is a process, not a miracle. She started going to the public library not for the books at first, but for the calm. Yet, inevitably, she began to read. First light novels, then survival stories, then biographies of women who rebuilt their lives from scratch. In every page, she saw reflections of herself. An invisible character who decided to rewrite her story. And with every book closed, Martha felt some of her old strength returning. Fragile still, wavering, but alive. Loneliness, once her enemy, now began to look like a quiet ally. A fertile ground for her rebirth. With the little money she had, she bought a notebook. Simple cover, yellowed pages. She began to write. Small notes, lists, outpourings. She didn't call it a diary, she called it her refuge. Because there she could be honest, free from judgment. Writing gave her voice back. The voice that had been smothered by years of silence. The words were simple, but they carried pain, courage, dignity. Each line was a seed of independence. And little by little, she realized she wasn't just surviving. She was slowly blooming. By the end of that first week, something remarkable happened. Martha woke up without fear. For the first time since the abandonment, she didn't feel like she was in danger. She was still alone. She still had no guarantees. But there was a new kind of safety, internal, quiet, steady. As if she had recovered a forgotten piece of herself. The part that still dreamed. That still believed. That still wanted more. And right there, in that cheap motel room, Martha understood something profound. Beginnings don't come with applause. They start in silence. In small choices. In the courage to look at yourself in the mirror and whisper, "I'm still here." The motel routine, however, soon became heavy. The tiny room, the yellow light, the constant hum of traffic outside it all reminded her this was just a bridge, not a destination. She knew she needed a place where she could breathe without the suffocating sense of impermanence. One afternoon, while wandering the neighborhood, she saw a handwritten sign taped to a bakery window: room for rent. Family environment. The letters curved gently, almost tenderly. She hesitated. That old fear rose up, the fear of exposing herself, of being a burden. But something inside whispered, "Try." She called later that evening, her voice trembling. A woman answered Joyce. Her voice was firm but warm. They spoke for 5 minutes. Martha explained just a little, saying she was new to town and needed a quiet place. Joyce didn't pry. She simply gave her the address and said, "If you'd like to come see it, it'll be here until 7. Martha hung up, heart pounding, staring at the phone as if it might explode. But it didn't. It was just the world telling her, "Go. It's okay." Martha arrived at Joyce's house with her pulse racing. It was modest, with a small garden and crochet curtains. Nothing luxurious, but it radiated a comfort she hadn't felt in years. Joyce, a woman with cropped hair, deep skin, and a direct gaze, didn't smile right away, but she offered tea. They sat in the kitchen, and between quiet sips, something began. Martha couldn't name it yet, but it felt like home. The kind of home that doesn't live in walls but in presence. And after so much abandonment, presence was medicine. The room was small, but it had a window. Natural light. The smell of old wood. Joyce said the rent was low, as long as Martha agreed to mutual respect and helping keep the house in order. No absurd rules. Just coexistence. To Martha, it sounded like music. She agreed immediately. That night, she moved in with her few belongings. For the first time since the airport, she lay down on sheets that felt like an embrace. And for the first time in a long time she dreamed. Not of the past, but of possibilities. The next morning, Joyce made pancakes. Surprised, Martha offered to help, but Joyce only said, "In this house, if you live here, you eat here." Such a simple sentence, but it broke Martha open. It wasn't about food, it was about belonging. They sat at the table, shared coffee, talked about small things, the weather, neighbors, the cat. And Martha laughed. Not nervously. Not politely. But truly. Because in that kitchen, filled with the smell of coffee and warm batter, she felt something new. She wasn't alone anymore. As days passed, Life with Joyce became precious. They didn't become instant best friends, but there was respect. And respect was new. Martha could come and go as she pleased. She could sit in silence. She could exist without having to prove her worth. That little space, modest as it was, gave her something immense dignity. Having a place to sleep, to cook, to listen to music without judgment, those weren't just comforts. They were pieces of rebuilding. A true home doesn't need to be large, it just needs to be free. In the evenings, they sat in the yard with mugs of tea, talking about life. Joyce wasn't nosy, but she was attentive. That was enough. One day, when Martha lightly mentioned that her family had left her behind, Joyce simply said, "Not every cut is a loss. Sometimes it's liberation." Those words echoed for days. Because deep down, Martha knew it was true. The abandonment had carved space for this new chapter. A quiet beginning, yes, but filled with dignity, respect, and most of all, emotional autonomy. In that small house, with a new housemate and a shared kitchen, Martha finally understood belonging has nothing to do with blood. It's about presence, care, and listening. For the first time, she felt she could rest not just her body, but her soul. She still had much to rebuild. The scars hadn't disappeared. But here, they hurt less. And so, between pancakes, tea, and simple conversations, Martha began to believe something she thought was gone forever. Maybe, just maybe, it was possible to trust again. The savings she had managed to hold on to were already beginning to dwindle. Martha knew that freedom demanded more than courage, it demanded stability. She didn't want to depend on anyone, not on Joyce, not on chance. She wanted to stand on her own, with the strength of her own hands, with the effort that had been dormant for years. So, on a cloudy morning, she slipped on her most comfortable shoes and walked through the neighborhood streets carrying a simple resume, printed on recycled paper. Was she ashamed? A little. Afraid? Very much so. But above all, she had a fierce desire to reclaim her dignity. Not as proof to anyone else, but as a rescue of herself. After several polite refusals and tight smiles, she stepped into a small corner cafe. A place filled with the smell of fresh bread, the clatter of dishes, and crooked paintings hanging on the walls. She asked, timidly, if they were hiring. The young woman behind the counter, Heather, smiled warmly and called the manager. In less than 10 minutes, Martha was sitting with a cup of tea in her hands, telling her story, at least part of it. She said she knew how to deal with people, that she was organized, discreet, and willing to learn anything. The manager looked at her for a few seconds and then said, "Can you start on Monday?" The rush of emotion came unexpectedly. Martha nodded, thanked him, and left the cafe as if she had just been handed a second chance at life. It wasn't a high-ranking position, it wasn't a large paycheck. But it was a place. A role. A space where she could slowly begin to rebuild her independence. Monday suddenly felt both far away and urgent. That night, she carefully laid out her clothes. She ironed her blouse, set aside her shoes, and checked her purse 3 times. Like a young woman starting her very first job. But this time, she carried the weight of someone who had already lost everything and still decided to begin again. The first day was exhausting. Her back ached, her feet burned, but her heart felt light. She greeted customers, wiped down tables, learned to use the coffee machine and operate the register. Heather was patient, teaching her the details with good humor. The team was small, but welcoming. No one knew her story. And that was liberating. For the first time in years, she wasn't So-and-so's mother or So-and-so's grandmother. She was just Martha. And being simply Martha, in that brown apron, felt revolutionary. The identity that had once been dissolved in others was now beginning to rise again. The best moment came at the end of the month, when she received her first paycheck. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pay rent, buy groceries, and even carefully set a little aside. The envelope in her hands felt heavy with meaning. It was more than money. It was a symbol. She had worth. She had purpose. She had the power to choose. On her way home, She stopped at a small shop and bought herself a little gift, a necklace with a leaf-shaped pendant. "To remind myself that I can still bloom," she whispered, smiling with tear-filled eyes. Work itself wasn't new to her. She had worked her whole life, only it had been inside the home, unpaid, without vacations, without recognition. Now, it was different. Every hour on her feet brought something tangible. Every gesture was noticed, valued. And that gave her a powerful sense of empowerment. It wasn't about the title. It was about having her life back. About not depending on someone else's goodwill. About walking on her own 2 feet. That autonomy, which once felt like a distant luxury, was now part of her daily routine. And every morning, as she tied her uniform, Martha felt less fragile, more whole. Her co-workers began to draw closer. Heather became a friend behind the counter. Mr. Arthur, a regular, started talking to her every day. And the customers, noticing her firm yet gentle kindness, began calling her by name. Such a simple thing. But for someone who had spent years being ignored inside her own home, hearing "good morning," Martha carried the weight of an embrace. She began to understand that yes, it was possible to feel part of something again. And that work wasn't just a source of income. It was a source of self-esteem, of identity, of belonging. With each passing day, her fear shrank. Her body grew tired, yes. But her soul breathed easier. Because now she knew she no longer needed anyone's approval. The respect she had sought for years in others now came from within. And that was the most powerful achievement of all. In the cafe, among the smells of bread and the murmur of daily voices, Martha rediscovered the joy of existing, of being part of the world, of being useful, and, most of all, of feeling alive again. It was the beginning of a new era. Quiet, simple but profoundly transformative. As the weeks went by, Martha's routine began to take on the shape of stability. It wasn't a life full of adventure, but there was something deeply comforting in the predictability of each day. She woke early, made her coffee, walked to work breathing in the crisp Portland air, and greeted neighbors with a soft wave. It might seem small, but for someone who had lived in a constant storm of emotional noise, that peace was everything. And in that seemingly ordinary routine, bonds began to form, bonds she never imagined she would create. Genuine connections, free of obligation. Heather was the first to truly approach her. Young, full of energy, always with a joke on hand, she seemed to be Martha's opposite. And maybe that was why the connection happened. Heather started chatting during breaks, sharing stories of failed relationships, unfinished plans, frustrations, and small victories. Martha listened more than she spoke, but when she did, her words carried quiet wisdom. Over time, she became an informal counselor. Heather, half joking, would say, "You should write a book, Martha, about starting over." Then came Arthur, an elderly man with a cane and a crooked smile, who occupied the same table every afternoon. He always ordered the same coffee and a slice of cake. At first, they only exchanged nods. But one day, out of nowhere, he remarked, "You've got the hands of someone who's held up the world, you know?" Martha laughed in surprise and thanked him. From that day on, Arthur became a regular companion. He told stories about his youth, his late wife, his distant children. And in return, he listened to Martha with rare respect. They didn't talk about the future. They talked about memories. And that created a beautiful bridge between them. The neighborhood also began to notice her presence. Joyce, ever the good hostess, made sure to introduce her to the nearby residents. Within a few months, Martha was being invited to small backyard gatherings, community parties, and local fairs. She, who had spent so much time feeling invisible, was now recognized not by titles or roles, but simply for who she was in that moment. A woman who smiled slowly, but sincerely. A woman who listened with her heart and didn't judge. That alone was rare. And for that reason, deeply valuable. But perhaps the most unexpected bond was with a cat. A stray who appeared every afternoon in front of Joyce's house and little by little, made himself at home. Martha called him Captain. He didn't belong to anyone, but he seemed to have chosen her. He leapt into her lap without hesitation, purred as if he had been on that porch for years. And she, who was never much of an animal person, found herself caring for him tenderly. She bought food, arranged a box with a blanket, and talked to him during quiet mornings. It was funny. That wordless connection filled holes she hadn't even realized she carried. All those bonds, though discreet, began weaving a new web of belonging. And this web was different. It didn't imprison. It sustained. These were relationships built on presence, respect, and voluntary affection, not on obligations, demands, or predefined roles. For the first time in years, Martha felt free to be herself, without fear of rejection. And that gave her immense strength. Because when we find places and people where we can exist without shrinking, the soul begins to heal. And what once was mere survival begins to turn into life. She began recording everything in her refuge notebook. Each meaningful conversation, each unexpected gesture, each new feeling. And upon rereading, she noticed something surprising. Her story was no longer just about pain and abandonment. It was also about friendship, discovery, affection. The days, once so long and gray, now carried color. A soft, yet steady color. Martha was no longer merely recovering. She was building. Brick by brick, day after day. And that made all the difference. Because rebuilding doesn't mean forgetting what was lost, it means giving new meaning to what is gained. And it was in this atmosphere of everyday affection that, one day, she received a letter. It was from Kieran, her grandson. A simple envelope, with crooked handwriting and sincere words. And there, on that paper, was the confirmation that even in the deepest cuts, seeds of tenderness could still bloom. But that story, well, it was only beginning to unfold. For now, Martha kept weaving her bonds. Without hurry. Without fear. Because now she knew freedom is not loneliness. It is the power to choose who stays. And she was choosing well, with a clean heart and steady feet on the ground. The letter had arrived without warning, with no sender listed beyond the name Kieran scrawled in the lower corner. When Martha saw the envelope, her heart raced. It was as if time stood still for a moment, as though all the tranquility she had built over the past weeks suddenly trembled. She froze, holding the envelope, feeling the paper vibrate with expectation. Kieran. Her youngest grandson. The one who always had a different light in his eyes, a sweet, curious, attentive way about him. The only one who hugged her tightly, as if holding onto something precious. He was light, even amid those family shadows. She sat carefully on the sofa, as if the letter were sacred. She opened it with trembling hands. The handwriting was uneven, with some words crossed out and others written twice. But every line seemed to shout tenderness. "Grandma, why did you disappear?" was the first question, followed by an "I miss you," which wrapped around her like a warm hug on a cold day. He wrote about school, about tests, about dull afternoons without the stories she used to tell. There were no accusations, only longing. A pure, genuine kind of longing. The kind of feeling that does not demand, it simply reveals itself. Martha read and reread the letter. She cried, yes. But not from pain, she cried out of tenderness. Out of relief. Out of hope. Because in the midst of so many wounds, that boy had left one thread of affection untouched. And that thread meant everything. It was proof that not everything had been in vain. That despite the betrayal, there was still true love in that story. Kieran didn't know the whole truth. And he didn't need to. He simply missed her. And that was enough. Because sometimes, just knowing that someone out there still cares is enough to keep the heart beating strong. She spent days wondering if she should reply. She was afraid of getting too close and being ripped away again. But she also knew that this bond couldn't be ignored. It was delicate, yes, but real. So she bought old-fashioned stationery and wrote with care. She told him she was well. That she had sought a place where she could breathe in peace. That she missed the smiles and conversations they had shared. And that he would always be an important part of her story. She didn't promise reunions. She promised truth. And that, she knew, was the greatest gift she could give. She sent the letter without expecting a response. She didn't want to build hopes. But something inside her had already shifted. Knowing that Kieran thought of her, that he felt her absence, reinforced that her story had not been only about abandonment. There was love there. A love perhaps buried beneath toxic family dynamics, forced silences, conveniences. But one that still pulsed. And that gave her strength. Because when you know that someone misses you for who you are and not for what you provide, everything changes. Your self-esteem, your hope, your sense of the journey. In the days that followed, Martha began writing more. She created a small ritual of noting down her good memories with Kieran. The afternoons with carrot cake, the drawings he made, the funny questions he asked. Those memories became her shelter. And over time, she realized she didn't need to erase the past only to choose which parts deserved space in her present. Her bond with her grandson was just that, a subtle bridge between who she had been and who she was becoming. And this bridge, unlike so many others, was built on selfless love. And for that reason, it was strong. Joyce noticed something different. Martha seemed lighter, more serene. She told her about the letter, and Joyce replied with her straightforward wisdom, "Maybe he's your piece of emotional justice." Martha smiled. Emotional justice. Yes. That was it. It wasn't about revenge, or late recognition. It was simply about knowing that, in the middle of chaos, someone truly saw her. And that someone was a child. Which made it all the more pure. More honest. More dignified. Kieran was living proof that even the harshest stories can still hold tender chapters. From that moment on, Martha carried the letter with her. Folded carefully, tucked into her bag like a talisman. Whenever the world threatened to weigh too heavily, she would reread those crooked, love-filled words. Because even from afar, even without promises, that boy had given her something no one else had: presence. And that was worth more than any apology, any excuse. It was love. And love, when it comes clean, is the most powerful thing in the world. There was still a long road ahead. But with Kieran there, even just on paper, Martha no longer walked alone. The peace Martha had worked so hard to build over the last few months began to be subtly threatened. Not by something external, violent, or immediate, but by echoes of the past knocking once more, this time with white gloves and formal phrases. It started with a letter from a lawyer. An elegant envelope, with letterhead and carefully measured words. "We request contact for purposes of clarification and possible family reconciliation." It was as if the past she had buried with so much effort was trying to rise again, knocking politely but coldly at her door. She read and reread the letter. There was no emotion. Only formality. No question of how she was. No apology. Only an attempt to cover guilt with bureaucracy. Martha felt her blood grow hot. Not anger, indignation. After everything they had done, this was how they wanted to reach out? Through a legal intermediary, as if she were forgotten property or an out-of-place object. It hurt. Deeply. Because for a moment, she had wondered if maybe they were truly sorry. But no. It was just another attempt at control, disguised as concern. Days later, a friend of Joyce showed her a small article in a local paper. It mentioned an elderly woman supposedly missing and her family's concern. Martha almost laughed. The audacity was surreal. The family that had abandoned her was now playing the public victim, trying to twist the narrative, painting her as a confused, lost old woman. It was outrageous. But above all, it was revealing. They didn't want reconciliation. They wanted to clean their image. Her freedom unsettled them. Because an autonomous woman disrupts the power of those who always wanted to control her. The phone rang too. Over and over. Unknown numbers, some with the old area code from her former city. She didn't answer. She didn't want to hear past voices, coating poison with sugar. But the persistence was an emotional provocation. Because these indirect confrontations reopen wounds. They rekindle doubts. And for fleeting moments, Martha caught herself questioning everything. Am I being too harsh? Should I give them a chance? But those questions weren't born of reason. They came from old conditioning. From the fear of being labeled ungrateful. From the habit of blaming herself even for breathing. It was Joyce who brought clarity. She said bluntly, they want you back in the place you left. Not out of love. But because they can't stand seeing you stand tall. The words struck like lightning. And at the same time, like an embrace. Because deep down, Martha already knew. She just needed someone to say it aloud. And so, she decided. She would not reply to the lawyer. She would not seek out the family. She would not explain her absence to those who had never respected her presence. This time, silence would be her form of emotional justice. A clear, firm, non-negotiable boundary. But the turning point came with the unexpected encounter with Lisa, her daughter. It happened in a bakery, on an ordinary morning. Martha was buying bread when she heard her name, whispered under breath. She turned and saw her. Lisa, with dark glasses and a tense face, torn between fleeing and attacking. The conversation was brief. Cold. A request for explanation thinly disguised as longing. You could have called. We were so worried. Martha smiled softly and answered calmly, I waited for years for you to see me. Now, finally, I see myself. And that is enough. Lisa didn't insist. She didn't cry. She just swallowed hard, left the change on the counter, and walked out. Martha stood there, holding the loaf and with her heart pounding. It wasn't easy. It never would be. But it was necessary. Saying no to those who had hurt her wasn't revenge. It was self-care. It was empowerment. It was cutting the cycle of guilt that had kept her prisoner for so long. And in that instant, she realized she didn't need grand speeches. Only boundaries. Because sometimes the real confrontation isn't a fight. It's the peace you choose to keep even when the past comes demanding explanations. Back at the house, she burned the old letters. One by one. Not in fury, but as a ritual. A ritual of release. Of self-respect. Of closure. Joyce watched silently, offering her tea when it was done. And in that small gesture, there was understanding. Martha knew she would still feel. That longing would come, at times. That doubts would return. But now, there was clarity. She no longer needed anyone's approval. Her new beginning was legitimate. Her freedom, hard-won. Her dignity, intact. Because this time, she had chosen to stand on the most important side of the story, her own. The encounter with Lisa had made one thing painfully clear: there was no remorse, only discomfort at the fact that Martha had stepped out of the script. That realization was the final spark. She no longer wanted to live caught in emotional push-and pulls, waiting for crumbs of affection. It was time to end the cycle for good. No confrontations, no theatrics. Just respect for herself. The final cut would be silent, but deep. She began by burning the old letters, one by one, as a ritual of closure. Each flame carried away a piece of the pain, the weight, the illusion that there was still something worth saving. After that, she wrote a formal reply to the lawyer. Not to stir conflict, but to make things clear. I have chosen to live my life in peace. I ask that you respect my silence. That was it. Clarity, firmness, a full stop. It wasn't running away. It was autonomy. For the first time, Martha put herself first, not out of anger, but out of self-love. The past stopped knocking at her door. The phone calls ceased. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was freedom. From then on, there were no more doubts. She had stepped out of the role of the self-erased daughter, mother, or grandmother. Now, she was simply herself, whole and in control. With the past finally set in its place, Martha began to bloom. She bought herself a new coat, something she never would have done before. Navy blue, elegant, strong, just as she felt now. Every choice, no matter how small, stitched together a new image of herself. At work, she was respected. In the neighborhood, she was recognized. At community gatherings, she was welcomed. And in every space where she felt safe, her identity was being rebuilt not from what others expected her to be, but from what she decided for herself. She rediscovered old joys. Reading, now a daily habit. Gardening, with herbs and flowers she tended like living symbols of her own process. Her conversations with Joyce, her chats with Heather, the quiet coffees with Arthur, all of it filled her soul. She no longer needed to prove anything. Being who she was in that moment was enough. The woman who once silenced herself now expressed herself. In the books she recommended, in the flowers she planted, in the clothes she chose. This was a new version of herself, firmer, lighter, freer. Kieran's email came like a gentle breeze. He would be in town and wanted to see her. Martha agreed, without hesitation, but without expectations. They met at the park. No demands, only presence. He had grown, but his eyes were the same. Their hug said more than 1,000 words. They talked about life, about nothing, about everything. And when he asked if she was doing well, she answered, "Now I am. Because I've learned to take care of myself." And it was the truth. That boy was a fragment of love that had survived the shipwreck. And that was enough. When she returned home, she felt as if everything had finally fallen into place. Not because her problems had vanished, but because she had repositioned herself. The invisible Martha had stayed behind at the airport. The Martha of the present was now root, flower, and fruit of her own being. In the garden, beside Captain the cat and with tea in her hands, she understood once and for all she had not been abandoned, she had been set free. And the life she had built afterward wasn't meant to prove anything to anyone. It was meant to be lived. With respect, with courage, with autonomy. A true new beginning. And above all, one that was entirely hers. Martha's story isn't just about abandonment. It's about what we do when we are ripped away from our certainties. It's about transforming rejection into a starting point, solitude into a space for healing, and pain into fuel for rebirth. How many times have you been pushed aside, made invisible, treated as if you had no worth? Maybe it didn't happen in an airport, but in a relationship, in a job, in a social circle. The truth is, at some point, we all carry the weight of exclusion. And it is in that moment we must choose: do we break completely, or do we rebuild ourselves into another form? Martha chose the second path. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. And that's the crucial point. Courage doesn't appear like magic. It's born in the dark, when everything seems lost, when there's nothing left to lose. And it's at rock bottom that we discover we can dig our way out, if you prefer, spread wings and fly. Every step she took, the one-way ticket, the rented room, the cafe job, the unexpected friendships, her grandson's letter, was another brick laid in the foundation of a new life. The most beautiful part is that Martha's rebirth didn't come with great material gains, but with inner victories. With each gesture, she freed herself from the weight of living for others and began to live for herself. And that is a quiet invitation for all of us. How many times have you made yourself smaller to fit into places that were never truly yours? How many times have you erased yourself just to be accepted? Maybe it's time to learn from Martha. You don't need to wait for abandonment to set yourself free. You can choose today. Right now. It's important to understand that respect, dignity, and autonomy aren't luxuries, they are rights. They are the foundation of any fulfilling life. Martha only discovered this after betrayal, but you don't have to wait for a rupture to take that step. Starting over can be painful, yes, but it can also be liberating. And in the end, what once looked like an ending was nothing more than a beginning. Abandonment did not define her. What defined her was how she chose to face it. That is emotional justice, returning to yourself what was denied for so long. And if this story touched you in any way, if it reminded you of your own wounds, choices, or forgotten dreams, I want to invite you to reflect. What will be your first act of freedom? What can you do, even today, to reclaim a piece of yourself? It may be a small decision, starting a habit, saying no, writing down your feelings in a notebook. But remember, the greatest new beginnings always start with seemingly small steps. If you believe this message can help others see that it is possible to turn pain into strength, share this video and subscribe to the channel. Here, you'll find stories, reflections, and paths that can inspire you to write a new version of your own life. Because, just as Martha discovered, none of us need to stay trapped in the roles others write for us. And that is the most powerful lesson we can carry from this. It doesn't matter what was done to you, what matters is what you choose to do from here on out. Martha wasn't just abandoned. She was liberated. And with that freedom, she built a home within herself. And you? Have you thought about what kind of life you can build when you finally decide to truly take care of yourself?